Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. In our last episode, we looked at the evolution of the Tank Walker, one of the most commonly seen armored vehicles in Star Wars. Today we're going to be looking at the armored Tank Walker's smaller cousin, the Recon or Scout Walker, and talk about how it has evolved throughout Star Wars history. The endless wars of the Old Republic era between the Sith and the Jedi were amongst the most brutal the galaxy had ever witnessed. For one, unlike the Clone Wars, both sides usually were made up of organic troops, and two, because of the high amount of Force users on both sides, many of these battles oftentimes devolved into hand-to-hand fighting. With such a heavy reliance on dismounted infantry and large formations, the Republic Army and the Sith Army relied on faster mounted units to do recon, screen their own troops' movements, and to find enemy positions. Depending on the era and resources available, this usually meant some kind of domesticated animal or mechanical walker. The walker platform was preferred over wheeled or track platforms simply because it had better all-terrain capabilities. These walkers were also generally much lighter and faster than the larger tank walkers utilized by military organizations at the time. But it wasn't until the Clone Wars and the creation of the Grand Army of the Republic that we saw more of a standardization of these Scout or Recon walkers. One of the most common Scout walkers used by the JAR was the All-Terrain Recon Transport. Developed by Quat Drive Yards, this was one of the smallest AT vehicles at only 3.2 meters high and a top speed of almost 90 kilometers per hour or 55 miles per hour. It's one of my favorite walkers simply because it's so light and fast. With the advent of blaster technology and repeating blasters, having a high profile in the middle of a battle was quite dangerous. But at least the AT-RT was fast enough and agile enough to dodge enemy fire. It even had the capability to leap over large distances in order to get over obstacles. While the AT-RT was used for scouting and reconnaissance, it also allowed the individual clone trooper to travel over large distances and then fight as dismounted troops. The AT-RT was also used on several occasions for frontal attacks against fortified positions in enemy armor. Thanks to their speed and maneuverability, this was usually executed with limited casualties. The AT-RT was also surprisingly heavily armed with a repeating blaster cannon along with a mortar launcher. Like many of the vehicles in the JAR motor pool, the AT-RT could be carried by both the all-terrain tactical enforcer and also the low-altitude assault transport. This greatly increased its range. The AT-RT was a specialized piece of equipment that needed specially trained pilots known as ARF or Advanced Recon Force troopers to pilot them. These clone troopers were usually well-trained in stealth and reconnaissance missions, and used by JAR commanders to act as a screening force that protected the flanks and rear of a formation. They were also used to gather intel on an enemy position before an attack. The ARF troopers took pride in their AT-RTs, which made sense considering how dangerous it could be riding these walkers, especially into enemy fire. They also saw themselves as a bit superior to the average clone trooper, and believe it or not, the ARF troopers' training actually consisted of them riding living mounts before learning how to ride a walker. Around the time of the Battle of Coruscant, however, the ARF troopers were designated to a more traditional scouting role, and specialized AT-RT drivers were trained to replace them. These units were used more as mechanized cavalry. Ultimately, as the war continued, the lightly armored and exposed AT-RT became too dangerous for clone troopers to ride. The JAR started testing a variety of different walkers that were mostly enclosed, which increased the size, weight, and height of the walker. This is where we see the development of the Clone Personnel Walker, which featured twin laser cannons and a completely closed-off canopy. Then there was the all-terrain personnel transport created by Rothana Heavy Engineering, a subsidiary of Quat Drive Yards. This walker had a larger armored compartment that greatly increased the survivability of the pilot. The AT-PT was equipped with twin blaster cannons and a grenade launcher. It also had room for a co-pilot. Although it was considerably larger than the AT-RT, its forward position cockpit meant it was much lower to the ground than you would think. However, the AT-PT was considerably slower than the AT-RT with a top speed of only 60 kilometers per hour or around 37 miles per hour. This made it a much easier target to hit. Still, the AT-PT was considered a pretty successful design and would be used by the Imperial Army later on as an anti-personnel vehicle. And it was oftentimes used alongside Imperial irregular troops in areas with more difficult terrain to traverse. Then there was the all-terrain experimental transport, which actually had been around since Old Republic times. Manufactured by Rothana Heavy Engineering, this vehicle was much larger than the AT-PT at a height of around 9 meters tall. It still was piloted by one trooper, but it was far more heavily armed with double laser cannons and twin proton mortar launchers. Although still considered a reconnaissance walker, in reality, the AT-XP was more of a self-propelled artillery platform that could support infantry and other large walkers in an anti-personnel role. The AT-XP also featured a plasma deflector shield, which was quite unique for a vehicle this small. And as the Galactic Republic transitioned to the Empire, the GAR transformed from a conventional army to a peacekeeping army. The growing unrest on Imperial worlds led to the development of all-terrain riot-controlled transports. These were open-topped walkers that held 2 pilots. They were equipped with 2 medium blasters along with a suppression cannon for non-lethal work. In the years just after the rise of the New Order, we saw the deployment of the all-terrain defense pod designed by Quat-Drive Yards. This was by far one of the tallest scout walkers designed so far. At 11.6 meters, it reflected the Empire's need for psychological weapons as well as functional weapons. The AT-DP increased height made it a favorite for the suppression of local dissidents. Although not quite as imposing as the AT-AT, the AT-DP was still designed to stand out and be seen. But from a design standpoint, the AT-DP was not only unnecessarily tall, it was also unnecessarily thin, making it very easy to topple over. It was also pretty lightly armed and only had one heavy laser cannon on board. And although the armor on the AT-DP was thick enough to stop small arms fire and blaster fire, it wasn't really thick enough to protect it from much else. It was still susceptible to missile launchers and disruptor rifles. Even simple explosives like thermal detonators could do a considerable amount of damage against its weak leg joints. This is why the AT-DP was used more for peacekeeping missions on occupied worlds rather than frontline fighting. However, the AT-DP did have a pretty impressive top speed of 90 kilometers per hour. Another variant of the AT-DP, known as the All-Terrain Advanced Raider, was used by the Empire for more of a reconnaissance role. Now, all of the previous reconnaissance walkers that we've talked about so far led to the development of one platform known as the AT-ST, or the All-Terrain Scout Transport. It wasn't necessarily a great vehicle, but probably one of the most commonly deployed recon walkers used by the Imperial Army. The AT-ST was around 9 meters tall, but much bulkier than the fragile AT-DP. Also manufactured by Quat-Drive Yards, these scout walkers were designed to screen and protect the flanks of larger and slower moving AT-ATs and other larger armored tanks used by the Empire. The AT-ST still had an impressive top speed of around 90 kilometers per hour. And it was pretty heavily armed with a chin-mounted twin blaster cannon along with an additional twin blaster cannon on the side of the cockpit, along with a grenade launcher and missile launcher. It had room for 3 in the cockpit, but usually there were only 2 pilots. Now, the size of these vehicles meant that these walkers no longer truly reconnaissance or scout walkers. Instead, they were like light tanks. This also meant you no longer needed scout troopers to pilot them. Instead of being seen as mounts as the AT-RTs were, these larger vehicles were basically walking tanks at this point. So special Imperial Army drivers were trained to use the Scout Walker. Now, one of the really cool features in the AT-ST, which really helped it with its anti-personnel role, was a 360 holographic view of the battlefield. This really eliminated any kind of blind spots the vehicle could have. While the AT-ST cockpit was pretty well armored against blasters and other small arms, it still couldn't withstand a true anti-tank weapon, which made it quite vulnerable considering how large the vehicle was. Its 2 legs also meant that it was quite unstable and could easily be tripped up or fall because of uneven terrain. The AT-ST design looked good on paper, but it clearly was too lightly armored and too large to be an effective fighting machine. And because of this, it made a really easy target for rebel troops. The Imperial Scout Troopers, who essentially took on the same role that the ARF troopers once did during the Clone Wars, now rode speeder bikes on their missions rather than these large walking tanks. Now, the AT-ST platform was very modular, and there are a lot of different varieties of them, including the all-terrain Kashyyyk transport. The massive foliage and forest on the Wookiee homeworld made things incredibly difficult for Imperial forces there trying to suppress the local Wookiee rebellion. The AT-KT, or all-terrain Kashyyyk transport, was basically an AT-ST equipped with 2 large net guns. The Empire wanted to avoid killing Wookiees because they made very good slaves. Another variant known as the AT-MP, or all-terrain missile platform, was a heavily armored version of the AT-ST, which had rotary chain guns and 8 missile launchers, making them incredibly dangerous. There was also the all-terrain construction transport, which had tractor beam generators on board, which were used to move around heavy material and equipment. In typical First Order fashion, the all-terrain Scout transport was upgraded with a new gyroscopic leg mount, which made it much more stable. The First Order AT-ST was also given next-generation composite armor, which was a great improvement over existing Durasteel plate armor. The last Scout Walker we're going to be talking about in this video is also another First Order design known as the All-Terrain Heavy Scout. We don't really have much information about this vehicle because it was cut from The Last Jedi, but it did seem to have an AT-ST cockpit, but this was placed on a much more robust, almost spider-like platform with multiple legs. So there you have it, guys. That's the evolution of the Scout Walker. As you can see, the Walker platform basically makes these vehicles a bit too high and exposed for any kind of true reconnaissance vehicle. You basically stick out. Anything beyond the AT-RT was just way too large and way too slow to really pull off a scouting mission. Anyway, let me know in the comment section below what you think about these various platforms. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.